So the first thing I'll show you is that to get ready to seam KT's Ferocious Briocheous, I have looped the two ends together here. You can see that I have a half twist in the fabric so that there is, we're going to get that sort of Mobius shape, right? So this end is just folded over, but then this end I've twisted it one time and then folded it over. So you can see that I've used closing stitch markers. You could also use safety pins, some kind of pins to pin the two edges together. And I've done that because, as with any seam, it's very easy to sort of lose track of the two sides and find yourself too far ahead on one side compared to the other side. And so in this case, what I've done is to match going along at fairly regular or at a very regular interval and a fairly small interval, the two ends one to another. Now, because you've got the twist, you're actually going to be matching a ridge to a gutter on the two different ends rather than a ridge to a ridge. So as you're laying it out, you can sort of go, count them along the way. So count out, several different ridges, same number of gutters, and put your pin. And that's what I've done all the way along. You can see that I've also saved, let me get a little bit of distance here, I've also saved quite a long tail. Ooh, there's my open desk drawer. That's probably longer than I need, but I'm trying to keep a long tail for seaming because that way that's one fewer end to weave in, and it's also then I don't need to secure my seaming yarn before I actually do the seaming. Okay, and now I have my my needle hooked onto my thread, and this is a sort of smaller size of tapestry needle that I'm going to use for my seam. And let me show you here on this fabric what it is that you're going to be working with. And I'm going to take this first pin out because it's kind of in the way, and I know where I'm starting anyway. So I've got my two ends, and here's the other tail. I'll try to keep that out of the way. Now, if you look at the two edges of the fabric, you can see sort of a row of, they're not stitches. What this is, I think, if I remember correctly, this is her cast-on edge, and this is her bind-off edge. And so what I've got here are these little loops that are the actual binding off of the stitches, right? You can see we've got stitches looped over one another. And what I'm going to use are those loops and then the corresponding loops from the cast-on edge. Those are the two things I'm going to connect to one another for my seam. The seam that I'm going to do is a super simple whip stitch, and I'm basically just going to be looping the yarn in one side, the other side, the other side, the other side, and making it nice and tight as I go along, just sort of connecting those two edges together. Now what that means is that unlike something like a mattress stitch where you end up with a ridge on the wrong side, right, like you're used to finding on the inside of your sleeve or whatever, there isn't really going to be any kind of a ridge. These two little bits of edging are going to be held right together, and you'll have a nice flat piece of fabric. Alright, so I've already got the yarn that I'm going to use for seaming connected over here on my bound off side, so I don't need to attach it there. So I'm just going to come over and hook it into the very edge of my fabric on the cast-on side. Sort of pull those together. Now you can see I've got my first of the bound off loops here. I'm just going to come underneath both strands of that. You want to make sure you get both strands of yarn. Loop my yarn back around. And then come over on my, I'm having a little bit of a harder time seeing this, but I'm going to come over on my cast on side and again look for those 2 strands of yarn, come under them both, bring my yarn around, and then just keep going along. Come over here, find another one, and you know, you can, how precise you are with this is up to you. Do you want to get at every single one? That's fine. Get one bit of yarn from each side. If you feel like you don't need to be quite that perfect, you probably could do it every couple of sets of loops. Just underneath these 2 strands, then over onto this side and under those 2 strands, and bring them together. Alright? So you're starting to get this sort of coil of yarn that's wrapping those 2 edges of the fabric together. I'm going to work a little bit more of that and then show you what it looks like. Alright, so Fiona is here now to help me show you what the seam is looking like. You can see that I've actually gone past one of the pins and I've come to the next pin. And each time that you get to a pin is a great time to sort of check how you're doing with your progress. You can see in this case that I've got the 2 edges of my fabric are still staying where they should be, right? Sometimes if you're seaming and things aren't even, you'll end up with more of one side of the seam sort of pooching up before the pin, while the other side is maybe looking a little stretched, and that indicates that you're not getting the 2 sides evenly. But in this case, there's just a little bit of fabric there before my pin, so you can see that the seam has been nice and even. And every so often as you're seaming, you just kind of want to check your tension. In this case, I've tried to make sure that I've got it, you know, snug enough to keep the seam from pulling apart, but also loose enough to keep the fabric the way it's supposed to be. I can't really bring this any closer because I think I lose the focus function, but you can see that the stitches here are brown, and if anyone looks really closely they'll see that brown against the blue, but you know, mostly this is the kind of thing that someone's not going to be looking at super close, and anyway the 2 yarns complement one another, so it's alright. So at any rate, you just keep going like that all the way across your seam. Alright, I've finished my seam. I'm going to try to do this as unshaky as possible, but I've got to hold the camera up a little bit for some height. You can see that the seam goes all the way across now, and the, you know, I've got my nice whip stitches there connecting the 2 pieces. There's no ridge on this side or on the other side. There's a little bit of a divot, of course, between the 2 pieces of fabric, and as I said, the ridges don't match up because of the twist that we put in the fabric to make the Moebius shape. But I've got my end here that has, you know, started at the one side, come out the other side. All I have to do now is weave it in, and I've maintained the flexibility of the fabric there. So that's always important to check as you're working along. And that's a simple seam for your Ferocious Briocheous.